Good evening, my friends. What can we say about this most important passage in the Gospel of St. Matthew? Have you noticed that all love songs, and I mean all, always use superlatives when they speak of love? The highest, the closest, the happiest, the dearest, the loneliest without you. Is there anything greater than love? Jesus will tell us in today's Gospel, the 30th Sunday of the year, that the greatest commandment is love. Loving God and loving our neighbor. The context of today's Gospel is still the same as that of the previous several weeks. The heightening tension and conflict between Jesus and the important leaders of the Jews. Last week, some Jews, along with the Herodians, tested Jesus about the temple tax. Next came the Sadducees, who also tried to embarrass him with a question on the resurrection of the dead. Now came the Pharisees, who presented Jesus with the greatest challenge of all, to finally bring about his downfall in front of the people. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the law, tested him by asking, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" We did not read it, but Jesus also had a confrontation with the Sadducees, another group of Jews who were composed of the priests and the aristocratic elite. This was also a very influential group. However, they were opposite of the Pharisees, who were the more religious and stricter sect of Jewish leaders. In terms of beliefs and affiliation, they were miles apart. The Sadducees accepted only the 5 books of their scriptures, the Torah, while the Pharisees accepted all the books in their Bible. They did not believe in the resurrection of the dead, while the Pharisees believed it. They were sympathetic to the Roman occupiers, while the Pharisees detested the Romans. However, they became united for one purpose, in their hatred and persecution of a common enemy, Jesus. They saw him as a threat, not to their position as leaders, because Jesus did not bother about rank or position. Both these groups of leaders have been accustomed to ruling the people with their brand of righteous living and strict morality, which is easy for them, but very burdensome for the people. And they would not allow nothing or nobody to change the way things were being done. Along came Jesus, who saw their pretensions and hypocrisy and started to accuse them of such. Their reactions to Jesus started with suspicion, then distrust, then confrontation, and finally hatred. All of these were summed up in the phrase, "they gathered together," which in the Old Testament meant an atmosphere of conspiracy and hostility. That was the context why a scribe questioned Jesus. It was part of their plot to finally bring him down. It mentioned a scholar of the law, sometimes translated as a scribe or a lawyer. Well, it basically referred to a pious Jew who dedicated himself to understand and master the scriptures their Bible, which is what we refer to now as the Old Testament in our Christian Bibles. Now, look at this situation. An expert, a scholar, an authority in the law was debating with a layman, a simple and ordinary Jew. In our situation now, we can call this a lopsided debate. No match for the layman. A sure win for the expert, isn't it? And the question asked by the lawyer was one of the most highly contested questions in first century Israel. There was not even a consensus, a clear agreement among all the experts on what is the correct answer, which is the greatest commandment in the law. Again, like last Sunday, whatever Jesus would say as the greatest commandment, no matter how correct or logical it was, it would still be challenged and not accepted by many, simply because they believe in another answer. He will still turn off many Jews because they have their own answers. Clever plot, isn't it? A sure way to pin him down. But I will say this again. They have underestimated Jesus yet again. Why was there no precise agreement on the answer to the greatest commandment in the Jewish law? First of all, the law refers not only to the 10 Commandments, but to the entire set of books which comprise the first 5 books of their scriptures, which they call the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now we call them the Pentateuch. The Jews believed that God revealed the law to Moses, which were all written down, not necessarily by Moses, into those 5 books. Now, the law is said to contain 613 commandments, 365 prohibitions or negative laws, meaning you shall not do this, you shall not do that. 365 means 1 for each day of the year. And 268 prescriptions or positive orders. You shall do this, you shall do that. 268. Why? 1 for each bone of the body. Of course, since all of them came from God, all are important. But some were regarded as heavy or very important, while others were looked upon as less heavy or less important. The lawyer, whose profession it was to study the law all the time, would certainly know the answer, while Jesus, an ordinary lay Jew, presumably would not know it. Well, surprise! Jesus would not ask the lawyer for a coin or a Bible. Jesus would direct him to the most important, not only as a commandment, but the very foundation of their Jewish faith. He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second's like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these 2 commandments." I find it very interesting that, like what he answered the Herodians about the census tax last week, and in other similar situations, Jesus doesn't give the most expected answer. Yun bang sasabihin niya lang yung gustong marinig ng karamihan? Okay na, para matapos lang ang usapan. What would an ordinary Jew at his time answer as the greatest commandment? Probably he would choose the first commandment in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments as the greatest commandment. The first commandment was, I am the Lord your God. You shall not have any strange gods before me. That was certainly the most logical answer. But Jesus isn't after only for what is the easiest, or the most logical, or what is commonly expected. Jesus would always give what is the best, the greatest, the fullest. That's why in St. John, he said, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. His answer as God's greatest commandments are twofold. Mind you, his enemies only asked for one commandment. Jesus gave two. What does that tell you? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Since this is the most important part of our reading and the main message of our celebration, let us carefully analyze it. The greatest commandments of Jesus were taken from their scriptures. The first part, the love of God, was taken from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verses 4 to 5. And the second part about the love of neighbor was taken from the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 18. This meant that Jesus was only quoting God himself, who is the author of the scriptures. Jesus did not invent the greatest commandment, but quoted from the very words of God. Who could argue against that? Secondly, Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 to 5, was the passage where the Jewish religion got its most significant prayer, called the Shema, which means hear or listen. In fact, the verse begins precisely with the words Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. All these words which I command you this day shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk to them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you wake. And you shall bind them as a sign upon your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And these verses, particularly verse 4, later became like a creed, a basic tenet or doctrine that they would recite or pray 3 times a day, when they wake up, at noon, and when they lie down or sleep. Just like we Catholics recite the Angelus 3 times a day, morning, noon, and evening. Thus, the Shema stood out as their most recited prayer. Everybody knew it. Everybody prayed it. So, and this is the third point, when Jesus answered the scribe by giving him the Deuteronomy 6 verse 4, he not only gave an uncommon or wild answer, he was actually giving him the most commonly known and most essential prayer of the Jews, the Shema. Who could go against something that everyone accepts, everyone prays, and everyone believes in? And Jesus himself prayed it every day. And I guess even Mary and Joseph, as faithful Jews, prayed that prayer every day. So, Jesus makes this verse from the book of Deuteronomy the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, meaning your will, with all your soul, meaning your life, and with all your mind, your intellect, your intelligence. which was the Jewish way of saying the complete whole person. In other words, you will love God with all that you have and all that you are. It is a total gift of self to God, even unto death, which Jesus himself did. The second commandment that Jesus attached to the principal commandment was taken from another book, the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 18. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments. As I mentioned earlier before, Jesus was asked to identify just the greatest commandment. He gave two commandments instead. When Jesus did this, he was showing himself to be a very dedicated and diligent religious person, keen and attentive to the very meaning of their religion. In our language today, Jesus was taking his religion seriously. We can ask ourselves, do we do that for our Catholic faith? Do we take our Catholic religion seriously? Now, why do I say this? Because Jesus was aware that even at his time, the Jews believed that the two commandments were the most important among all the others because they summarized the two tablets of the Ten Commandments given to Moses by God. As we know, the first three commandments were about God and our love for Him. You shall have no other God besides me. You shall not use my name in vain. Keep the Sabbath. While the next 7 commandments, honor your parents, do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not covet your neighbor and his property, were essentially our love for neighbor. Jesus was not inventing a new thing, but was simply re-emphasizing the very foundation of their religion, which consisted of the law and the prophets. That's why he concluded that the whole law and the prophets depended on these two commandments. Their whole religious tradition of law and prophets was entirely dependent upon the commandment of love. And there could not be any genuine fulfillment of the law if it did not flow from love of God and love of neighbor. While the command to love God first and foremost with one's whole being, the love of neighbor, though not the same commandment, but very much related, was more concretely emphasized. That is what we read from the first reading, from the book of Exodus, which is part of the law of the Jews. And this is the practical application for the Jews of love of neighbor. This particular segment of the law deals emphatically on the sacred duty of a Jew towards the alien, the widows, the orphans, and those who are in financial difficulty. Thus says the Lord, you shall not molest or oppress an alien, for you were once aliens yourselves in the land of Egypt. You shall not wrong any widow or orphan. If you wrong them and they cry to me, I will surely hear their cry. My wrath will flare up, and I will kill you with a sword. Then your own wives will be widows, and your children orphans. If you lend money to one of your poor neighbors among my people, you shall not act like an extortioner toward him by demanding interest from him. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, you shall return it to him before sunset, for this cloak of his is the only covering he has for his body. What else has he to sleep in? If he cries out to me, I will hear him, for I am compassionate. Notice the frightening punishment of God for anyone who would not obey this commandment. My wrath will flare up, and I will kill you with a sword. This might really sound cruel, but I guess it's the Jewish way of telling us the great importance of this commandment. It should never be taken lightly by anyone. It was as if God was saying, do not ever fail to do this commandment, for the alien and the widows and the orphans and the financially burdened are important to me. I love them. This call to obey and imitate God is what our second reading is talking about from the first letter of St. Paul to the Thessalonians. Here, in the continuation of Paul's instructions to the Thessalonians, he reminded them first of the humble example they showed the people while living among them. And because of Paul's good example, the Thessalonians themselves copied his example of humility, patience, and charity, that they became themselves models everywhere in that region of Macedonia and Achaia. This reading from St. Paul is already an application of the love of God and love of neighbor that we have seen in the Gospel and in the first reading. Our love for our neighbor is our way of copying the love that God has constantly shown us. Effective loving our neighbor is simply careful imitating the love of God for us. How do we apply in our life this dual commandment of love that we learned today? First of all, there is only one great commandment, to love. It has two directions, not the same as each one, but can never be separated from each other. Loving God and loving our neighbor. In fact, one reveals the other when acted upon. When we love God, we have to prove it or reveal it by loving others. And when we love others, it can only come or it will reveal our love for God. How about those people who love others, yes, even sincerely, totally, unselfishly, but do not believe or accept God? Is this case an exception? No. Because if there is genuine love for others, its genuine source is God. It is just that man stubbornly refuses to acknowledge it in his ignorance, his pride, and indifference. All true love comes from God, whether you accept it or not. Secondly, this command of loving must be done over and over and over again, just like our prayer. We never stop praying. We should never stop praying. We should pray continuously, even the same prayer, over and over and over again. Because when we do that, just like when the Jews pray the Shema 3 times a day, every day, their prayer shapes their way of thinking and ultimately their way of living. They become their prayer. Thirdly, our actions flow from what we love. I read books because I love books. I go jogging because I love to exercise. I eat because I love eating. As a Jew, Jesus prays the Shema Israel with heartfelt devotion. He has entered into the heart of the Jewish religion, and he never left. He has made the heart of his religion his very own heart. That is why it was so easy for him to admit the greatest commandment. the greatest commandment is the nearest to his heart. Love of God and love of neighbor. If we repeat to ourselves several times a day that we love God and we love our neighbor, our minds will be influenced and even conquered by it. And if we are sincere and humble, we will act what we pray and think about, loving God and our neighbor. Our life here on earth is so short. Let us start loving God and everyone else again. We have no time to lose. And God bless us all.